Welcome to Tuesday Talks. I'm Seema Kumar. I'm the CEO of Cure. Today we're sitting down with Vishal Mehta. He's a founder of Ubuntu Research. Vishal has more than 22 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry. He started his career in Mumbai, India, before coming to the United States, where he did clinical research at Washington, D.C., at George Washington University. Vishal built his career around drug development and research, and he successfully led teams across multiple drug development programs in both hematology and oncology product development that ultimately led to global product licensing at Novartis, Celgene, and Autolus. In 2022, Vishal founded Ubuntu Research to bring modern age medical innovations for gene and cell therapy treatments to patients faster, no matter where they are in the world. In other words, what Ubuntu is trying to do is to democratize treatment, democratize access to medicines by making things like clinical development more approachable, more accessible to preclinical stage companies. Ubuntu Research bridges the gap between science and patients by applying agile clinical, regulatory, and project management disciplines using a subscription-based solution called Dimension T model to help early-stage biotech companies strategize, plan, and execute clinical development programs efficiently. Welcome, Vishal. Welcome to Cure, and welcome to Tuesday Talks. So I want to get right into it. Ubuntu, when I first saw the name Ubuntu Research, I said, well, that's an African word. Yeah. That's a word for, doing good for humanity. Is that correct? Why did you choose that name?
Absolutely. First of all, Seema, thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in person and speak to you a little bit about what we do at Ubuntu. So I get that reaction a lot of time, right? I mean, it's either the Linux operating system or some vague African term that someone would have heard at some point in time. But when we were thinking about the genesis of our organization and the work that we wanted to do, Ubuntu resonated with our purpose of, essentially it's a word that means humanity. But humanity is a very subjective and a very broad term. So the way we interpret Ubuntu in the work that we do is how do we bring equity and access in healthcare? And how do we do that in a way that's efficient, that allows, the new generation of biotechs to actually develop their drugs for the wider population and make them accessible to everyone in the world, right? Which is a very difficult notion for some of these smaller companies to really put their hands around. If you're not a large organization who's done this many times before, it requires a level of evolution. And that's where we sort of come in and help these companies migrate from a small biotech into a clinical stage entity.
So, the clinical stage, because that's what you're focused on, right? When we talk about access and equity and access to products, you're typically talking about products that are already marketed and then making those products accessible, to the last patient on the last mile. But here you're talking about clinical capability. Why is that important in access and equity?
Well, I mean, I think that's there's a multitude of facets that we can look at that question, but the one that we can speak about today is really about patient enrollment and patient participation in clinical trials, right? So I think we have historical data that shows that in oncology trials, it's roughly about 4 to 6% of qualified patients that generally participate in trials. So the question here is, how do we democratize to the point that you mentioned earlier and allow greater level of access both within US and ex-US for patients to participate in some of these, key turn trials that are happening, specifically in the area of cell and gene therapy, which, delivers another layer of complexity in terms of how you think about treatment, how you think about, patient enrolling in clinical trials. And then I think we can extend that beyond clinical into the commercial setting as well, right? Because we know that many of these trials are sort of on the accelerated approval pathway. They have a shorter shelf life in terms of executing, and then the product becomes commercial. So.
Yeah. And so, you worked at some of the largest pharmaceutical companies, right? You saw an ever-changing landscape of how drugs were developed and its shift really in the ecosystem. So tell me about this change and how your company is helping early stage companies from preclinical to clinical stages in a compliant, cost-effective way. Because going from preclinical to clinical stage, I mean, that's like a bit of a leap, right? And because it takes a lot of capital.
That's right.
going from, preclinical to clinical stage, and so to doing it in a cost-effective way is important.
Absolutely. So, one of the other things that you mentioned earlier, which is, subscription-based orientation to clinical services, is what we have largely focused on, right? Because I think as you look at the current ecosystem of how drugs are developed in the small biotech, these companies are really limited to two options. They can either build their internal infrastructure and put a lot of capital towards that build side of the organization, or they rely heavily a lot on outsourced services. And each of these has its own sort of shortcomings associated. So the way we've developed our model and our business service is really looking at how we can achieve time value savings, which means doing things faster, and how we can mitigate risk along the journey because of the experience that we bring into these organizations so that things are much more risk adjusted, if you want to think of it from that perspective, or have the ability to go through the clinical process in a more streamlined manner.
Yeah, and so, your subscription model, right? It's called Dimension T, right? And
T
it's
for
got
time.
T for time. Okay, so it's the dimension of time that you're able to contract, maybe.
Correct.
It consists of three phases, right? People, process, and technology. So tell me how do all of this contribute to actually contracting the dimension of time?
Absolutely. So, this largely came from my most recent experience where I was at an emerging stage cell therapy biotech company. And what we realized was it takes a lot of effort for small companies to identify resources, the people, the talent, to really establish the business processes that are necessary to run clinical trials. We all know that, these trials have to be managed in a highly regulated environment. So everything from policies to SOPs to work practices have to be developed even before you can dose your first patient. And then on the technology side, there's a suite of clinical, technologies and solutions that have to be embedded within the business processes, within the trainings of these individuals. So we have essentially taken a holistic look at this and combined it in one product, which is Dimension T, which is what we call the plug and play for biotechs, right? Because these biotechs don't necessarily have to reinvent what has already been created in the larger ecosystem. And the idea is to really use it for the purposes that is important for these companies, which is to reach the next important business milestone for them, which may be a proof of concept, which may be a phase 1 or a phase 2 readout.
So how many companies have you helped so far?
So we're going through our initial set of a handful of companies that we're working with. There's bits and pieces of our solution that are being adopted. But I think this is the evolution that we're in, where as we speak to the companies, they themselves are readjusting or recalibrating their internal organizational design, their internal capital budget allocation policies, so that they can start to become a little bit more accommodative to this idea that they do have this option available. One of the largest feedback that I get from the CMOs and CEOs is they have never thought about drug development from this perspective. So it's taking a bit of a cycle for them to really adjust to this way of doing drug development in a more architected, collaborated, and a less onerous way on the CEOs and the CMOs.
Yeah, and adoption always takes a little bit of time,
That's right.
right? Of a new technology. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs who are looking to execute a clinical development program?
Well, I think I would say the best thing is that, we are in an age where, information is freely available. And, with the proposal and solution that we're bringing out there, we hope that entrepreneurs are much more attuned to this idea that, it's fail fast, fail early. Mm-hmm. And what I add to that is fail cheap, right? Because what you want to do is not invest too much of your resources in fixed infrastructure that you're going to have to carry through should you not succeed phase 1, should you have to go back to your labs and do some more product development work. So this is what I would sort of recommend to entrepreneurs as they're thinking about this ecosystem is think about utilization of clinical services more on a subscription-oriented way that allows them to have that flexibility, the nimbleness to grow their business as they reach important business milestones.
So how is this different from a CRO?
So CROs, I would say, typically provide tactical services. What our company does is it sort of does more of the strategy and the design of the clinical program. So we're more of the internal think tank of the company that really helps plan the clinical strategy, the regulatory strategy, the market access strategy. And we actually have partnerships with CROs to enable the execution where we have streamlined quite a bit of downstream activities. Again, the idea is that we don't want to recreate this for every biotech, for every company that's going through this process. We want to standardize it, democratize it, and liberalize the way clinical research is done.
And so, the subscription-based model means that you only buy or use as much as you need at any given time, and you pay as you go, rather than having to invest all of it upfront in developing a full-scale clinical development program.
That is largely the case, and gives the entrepreneur the confidence that everything is available. It's just to pick and choose on where they are, if they're at a pre-IND stage, if they are just ready to file the IND, if they want to start the clinical trial. There's different aspects of people, process, and technology that we would embed in those scenarios.
So you're essentially like the external clinical organization where you can, quote unquote, I'm going to call it outsource your clinical development strategy, because you're a preclinical stage company and you don't have the resources to build that whole clinical development arm. So we can use a company like yours, Ubuntu Research, for that.
I think that's a good description. A couple of things that I would add to that is what we've done is, for example, on the technology side, we've created standardized databases, right? So one of the biggest pet peeves that I hear from early stage biotech companies is, well, it takes me 12 weeks to even build a database for me to collect any data, for me to show any investor that I have clinical data, right? So the question that we put on the table is, why do each company has to go through this kind of a cycle of developing things when these are easily available? So we have a library of CRFs, data standards, et cetera, that are available. On the back end, again, to give assurance to these companies, what we've done is we've created a data product that allows the assimilation of all of the data that's collected in a clinical trial. Specifically in cell and gene therapies, it's more than just the clinical data. It's your manufacturing, your quality, your process control data, that all becomes part of the package that you submit to the FDA. So we've sort of created many, many such platform level solutions that allows companies to feel comfortable to partner with us, not just on a service basis, but truly on an end-to-end basis from IND to BLA filing.
That's great. That's wonderful. So before we leave, tell us what's next for your company.
One of the next things that we're eagerly working on is really to see how we can influence this in a manner that's much more broader than what our teams can handle and produce. So we're in conversations with venture capital firms to see if we can create this in a way that allows all of the portfolio companies within the venture capital group to be able to take advantage of this resource on a more centralized basis. And again, start to create much more of that standardized tool set for that VC private equity firm, so that they can start to build a little bit more of a confidence around the execution of these programs. Because as we've seen, particularly in cell and gene therapy in the oncology field, is execution is key to delivery, right? You may have the greatest of science, but if you can't get it through the different stages of clinical development, you're not able to translate that into patient benefits.
Well, thank you so much, Vishal. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for visiting Cure, and thank you for your passion and for getting treatments and cures to patients all around the world faster and cheaper.
It's a pleasure, and I think we're all on the same mission. So thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you.